Throughout my degree in creative writing, there was one piece of advice I heard from every professor. You would have heard it before. That advice is show, don't tell. This is great advice for beginner writers, but it misses one key point. Telling can be just as effective as showing. You just have to do it right. But before we get on to how to do that, let's look at the history of show, don't tell in order to understand it better. This piece of advice first surfaced in a famous quote from author Henry James: dramatize, dramatize, dramatize. These three words inspired Percy Lubbock, one of James's students, for his book The Craft of Fiction. This is the first real definition of it in writing. Lubbock expanded the advice to dramatize into what we now know as show, don't tell, saying, "The art of fiction does not begin until the novelist thinks of his story as a matter to be shown, to be so exhibited that it will tell itself." He supports this by saying that good writing should be like a moving picture or a stage drama. The reader should be able to see what is happening in the story. To give a quick example of what this might look like in writing, let's look at a passage from The Lord of the Flies. His face puckered, the tears leapt from his eyes, his mouth opened till they could see a square black hole. The crying went on, breath after breath, and seemed to sustain him upright, as if he were nailed to it. Now, compare this to another version that reads more like a stage direction rather than a play itself. The boy broke down and began to cry. Obviously, the first example is a much more potent example of showing. Unfortunately, Lubbock's conception of show don't tell is very basic and doesn't define it as specifically as we would like. This is where we can turn to Narrative Discourse by Gerrard Gennete. In this book, Gennete digs deeper into defining what showing and telling are. Showing to Gennete is a narrative of events in which the writing presents perceptually accessible things. This creates what he calls an illusion of mimesis, or an illusion of representation. He then defines telling as a narrative of words, in which the focus is instead on the presence of the narrator and what they are reporting. These two distinctions can be categorized in simple terms by distance. If we are pretending that writing is like a movie, this would be how close the camera is to the action. The narrative of events is zoomed in on the important action scenes, and the narrative of words is by contrast a much wider montage of everything, maybe with a voiceover. Jump to the modern day and everyone has redefined what showing versus telling means. If you take into account Lubbock's, Gennete's, and the other 1,000 definitions of showing and telling, it becomes very confusing and very paradoxical very quickly. For example, you can have a book where there's no explicit narrator creating a narrative of words, but characters' traits are told to the reader explicitly rather than being shown through dialogue, mannerisms, or physical description. In order to avoid this paradox, we have to reframe showing and telling as something defined by the reader and not by the writer. There are two things to consider here: the object and the manner of the reading. The object of a reader's imagination is the fictional world and the things in it. Manner is then the vividness of the reader's imagination. This can be summarized succinctly by saying either the reader imagines vividly experiencing the events of the story, or she only imagines getting a report by some fictional narrator. Important to note is that the manner of the reader's imagination is on a scale. It is like the comfortableness of a chair. There are factors that make the chair likely to be more comfortable, i.e. the cushioning, but the true determinant of comfort comes from the person who sits on it. This means that one passage can be more or less showing than another, just like how one chair can be more or less comfortable than another. So what makes one piece of writing more vivid than another? Underwriting is the first way in which writers fail to achieve this vividness. Underwriting involves not dramatizing something that should be dramatized. Remember, dramatize, dramatize, dramatize. To dramatize, you need to avoid excessive use of abstract emotional adjectives like happy or sad, and to also use dialogue instead of summarizing important conversations. You should be focused on clear, precise, and sensory prose. Think about the 5 senses and focus on nouns and verbs that help you to zoom in on the perceptually accessible things in the scene. The other way writers fail to achieve vividness is overwriting. This is where you overload your sentences with too many adjectives and too many similes that your important words get lost. Overwriting also occurs when you show too many unimportant events. For example, beginner writers often fall into the trap of starting their stories by showing every single thing their character does in the morning: waking up, having coffee, eating breakfast, rather than just summarizing this through telling in order to jump cut to the important scenes. Vivid writing produces questions. Good showing draws the reader to images and makes them work to understand the meaning of them. When we read a passage of good showing, we are thinking about how these images relate to the themes, characters, or motifs of the story. For example, if you show someone's hand shaking as they seal a letter, the reader is drawn to ask questions as to why this character might be nervous about the contents of the letter. This makes the reader dig deeper into your fictional world in order to find the answers. The more vivid the imagery, the stronger this desire to ask questions is. Now, here's the one piece of advice I want you to take away from this video. Good telling has the same goal as showing, to make the reader ask questions. The easiest way to tell good telling apart from bad telling is whether or not it makes you ask questions. How do we achieve this? It's simply a case of purposely underwriting. You need to leave out important details. You must also hint at the missing information. This creates a mystery for the reader and in turn actively engages them in asking questions. If you do this, you can achieve the same result as showing, but through telling. Let's look at an example from a book, An Artist of the Floating World by Kazuo Ishiguro. I chose this book because Ishiguro is 1, a Nobel Prize winner, and 2, he has mastered using both showing and telling to maximum effect. I was glad about Setsuko's decision to remain at home, for indeed, we had little opportunity to talk without interruption, and there are, of course, many things a father wishes to know about a married daughter's life which he cannot ask outright. But what never occurred to me that evening was that Setsuko would have her own reasons for wishing to remain in the house with me. This is a perfect example of brilliant telling. Notice the questions it makes you think about, and what information Ishiguro hides in order to make you ask them. First, we have the things a father wishes to know about a married daughter's life which he cannot ask outright. Here Ishiguro blatantly hides information from us. We don't get to know what the father wishes to know, but we know there's something going on here. We start to wonder about her married life and read the rest of the book trying to work out what that thing the father wants to know is. The last line is the most important here. This one read, "But what never occurred to me that evening was that Setsuko would have her own reasons for wishing to remain in the house with me." Here Ishiguro reverses the situation. Now the daughter wants to know something private about the father. Ishiguro could have easily told us what she wanted to know in this sentence, as in the story these events have already happened, but he leaves it out. And now as a reader I'm coming up with a bunch of questions about what his daughter's reason could be for staying at the house. Remember, this is all done through telling. Whether you are telling or whether you are showing, good writing should be a collaboration. It's about choosing these important images to show your reader when you are showing, and to use telling to get to them. You also need passages of telling to help the reader generate questions, and you can do this easily by just leaving out a bit of information. Writing and reading are collaborative. The writer provides the material, whether that be through showing or telling, and the reader's job is to interpret it. If you've achieved this, whether through telling or through showing, then you've succeeded in making a great piece of writing.